So, if you're watching this on YouTube, and nobody's watching live at this point because nobody knew it was going to be on, but if you're watching live on YouTube, you might wonder why I do this live on YouTube. When there's no audience built up, it's not a regular night. We don't really have a regular night yet. And there's a reason for doing it live on YouTube. It's because if I screw up and I'm not live, I'm tempted to start over. Even if I'm into the show 10 minutes, I'm tempted to start over. Also, if I do this live onto YouTube, then I don't have to do anything else for the YouTube. I don't have to upload it or anything. It's just there. So that it makes it easy. Let's do the show. No particular start time now. I can just start the music. From the studio in the bonus room above the garage on the north side of Cary. It is the Triangle Talk Show. Yeah, there we go. The Triangle Talk Show. And this is episode 27. Sticking with politics. September 5th, 2018. Gerry Mandate. Our good political friend, Gerry Mandate. You might remember him from ever. Long time now. This music seemed to end quickly when I was talking to Julia, but goes on forever when it's just me. Just me is Gary Pierce. And it is just me because no Julia tonight. I'm not sure how often Julia is going to be able to be on the show. We are thinking about switching to Saturday night, which is going to sort of be the best night for her to be able to be here. If you watched the last show, you saw that life has gotten busy for that girl. I'm retired. I can do whatever I want. I could do a show at 9:20 p.m. on Wednesday if I want to. But she's got stuff to do. Podcasting is an outlet, a release valve, but sometimes just can't do it. So we'll see. I am thinking hard about going back to Reddit. It's about the only place I know that's like a big area bulletin board. And it's a limited number of people on it, but those that are on it are engaged and interested to some extent, and do a casting call for additional show hosts. I'd like to expand a variety of things, diversity, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, things like that. I don't want any conservatives. No. Make me think, make me argue. Oh, yeah, sure, okay. Maybe some conservatives. So I'm thinking about doing that over on Reddit. Is there any other place I ought to do that? I don't know where to go on Facebook to reach people without spending money for an ad. So I don't know. We'll see. Gerry Mandate. Before I talk about what's in the news today, what's in the news today out there in the world is the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings. And Bob Woodward's book, Fear, comes out next week. I think I'm going to buy that. I don't read very many books because I don't really want to take the time. And when I start one, I end up staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning reading and having a hard time getting up the next day. And then just trying to get through it. If it's a page turner, if it's a good book, I expect this one will be a good one. But I got a feeling I will. The last book I read was James Comey's Honor something. I enjoyed reading that. Do I want to take a moment to talk about what I thought about the book and him? I mean, the book certainly portrays him as a flawed Boy Scout, kind of like McCain. A flawed human being, but with principles. And Comey is a man without a country, man without a party, rejected by everybody, and rejected by the Republicans, of course, and by the Democrats, even though he certainly leans everything he does lately in a Democratic direction. He committed the unpardonable sin of apparently keeping Hillary from being elected, so he has a lot of work to do to rehabilitate himself. Have you rehabilitated yourself? That's from Alice's Restaurant. Where was I? Wound a rabbit hole so deep I totally lost where I was going. Gerry Mandate. In the last show, I confused myself. I was pretty sure that North Carolina had 13 representatives in the U.S. House. And then I was also pretty sure it was 9 Republicans and 3 Democrats, which only adds up to 12. So you can consider me your primary pundit. You're all-seeing, all-knowing, all-knowledgeable political correspondent. It is 13, and it's 10 Republicans, which, of course, is worse than 9. And in the last show, it was, what was the name of the last show? Election Schmelection. We left with a cliffhanger. Didn't know which way the the federal district court for the middle of North Carolina was going to swing. Didn't know if they were going to decide that the districts that they had already decided were an illegal partisan gerrymander would have to be redrawn before the November 6th election. And that is, what is today? What did I say the date of this episode was? It's the 5th. Okay, so basically 2 months from now. So we didn't know whether at the end of the last show, we didn't know whether they were going to say that the districts had to be redrawn or not. Well, they have said. We did know, and we had just learned that the folks who brought the suit, Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, had told the court that they thought it was too late to redraw the districts. Things would be too upset. And the idea would be that if they redrew the districts, they would nullify the results of last May's primary for the congressional representatives, not for the state tickets, because they weren't ruling on anything about the state tickets, just the 13 congressional districts. So if they had decided to redraw the districts, they would have nullified the primary, changed the November 6th election to a primary for Congress, just for Congress, and then declared another election probably in early December because you need some time to campaign for the actual election. And the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, although they would like to see the maps redrawn and redrawn almost as soon as possible, maybe not quite, but almost as soon as possible, they figured an election in December would be such a low turnout, and low turnout elections tend to favor Republicans, that they'd be worse off with that election than they would be worse off with that election in fair districts than they would with a November 6th election under the current gerrymandered districts. I'm not sure how they did the math. I don't know. But anyway, that's the case. So the court made its decision. We're going to go with November 6th with the illegal, according to them, the illegal gerrymandered districts. The Supreme Court still may weigh in on that because there's nothing been decided about when and how to redraw those districts yet, just that it's not going to happen before November 6th. Really important that it happen before the 2020 elections, because that's going to set not the Congress, but the deciding to redraw the districts for the state representatives. Really important to do that before 2020, because that group, once they're in, will draw the districts for the next decade after the census. That's the way it works. Every 10 years, we do a census. Census determines where the people are. Where the people are determines how the districts are drawn. In theory, not taking into account politics, but in practice, can't get away from that. A lot of people have said they'd like to see districts that are completely politics and everything else blind. Just draw lines on the maps as practically square grids. The only requirement for a district is that they be approximately the same, pretty close to the same number of people in each one. And it's around 700 and something thousand right now. So that's what's going to happen, at least with Congress. We'll be having our with everything. We'll have our regular election. We're getting closer to understanding what's going to be on those constitutional amendments, the North Carolina Constitution, not the U.S. Constitution. I think that, and they're still fighting that out in court as to whether there are going to be 6 of them and how they're going to be described on the ballot. My simple solution, if you are lefty-leaning like me, is vote no on... You can vote no on all 6 and feel good about it. The one that is pretty nonpartisan is the one on victims' rights. Is that Mandy's Law? Am I remembering that correctly? And I'm pretty sure the folks that are promoting that amendment wish the rest of the flap about the amendments wasn't there, because they're getting caught up in it. My take on that is that, well, the essence of the amendment is Marcy's Law. Marcy's Law. I want to look something up and just make sure that's what it's called. The essence of the amendment is fine. Yeah, let's see. Marcy's Law, North Carolina. Oops, wrong button. There's where that is. Yeah, so that's what it is. What's in it is fine in my estimation. It doesn't need to be in the Constitution. And we look at the name, Marcy's Law. It's not Marcy's Amendment. It's not Marcy's constitutional amendment. It's Marcy's Law. That's what it should be. It should be a law. So if you're real strong on victims' rights and you don't think we'd ever get to the point where it could be just a law passed by our pretty broken General Assembly, then maybe vote for it as a constitutional amendment. But I don't think it needs to be there. I think it could be a law. Marcy's Law would be fine. How are we doing in that congressional election? I saw an interesting story just tonight. A poll has come out. This is for the eastern side of the Triangle Talk Show Zone, District 2 in North Carolina, which is east side of Raleigh, and then on east and kind of wrapping around Raleigh. The incumbent there is George Holding. Challenger is Linda Coleman. And new poll shows that she is leading by a point 45 to 44%. That is, I feel very official when I say this, that is within the margin of error. It's a dead heat. The poll is conducted by Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research. And the district is Wake, Franklin, Harnett, Johnston, Nash, and Wilson counties, some or all of those counties. It's a poll that was, well, it says that now Democrat challenger Linda Coleman has a poll of her own. Holding's campaign did a poll. It showed the same thing. So that would be a little unusual. Maybe that's some of the blue wave showing up in North Carolina. And even with the district as gerrymandered as it was to favor Republicans, Linda Coleman might pull it off. She just might. The rest of the state, I was looking at this map from 538.com. This is the whole country. This is kind of an awkward looking map of the whole country. And this is their forecast. This is their blue wave forecast for nationwide for the House, for Democrats to take over the House. And they are giving the Democrats a 7 in 9 chance of actually doing that as of today, 76.9%. They're giving Republicans a 2 in 9 chance of keeping control. That's not a lock. I've been listening to the 538 podcast, and they are very fond of saying that although that a 7 in 9 chance seems like pretty good odds, they were giving Trump like a 1 in 4 chance of winning. And of course, everyone thought, and their prediction, their odds as 1 in 4 were better than anybody else's in like the day or so before the election in 2016. So everybody looks at that and says, well, three out of 4 chances, 3 out of 4 chance goes to Hillary. Hillary's got it. Obviously, she didn't. And so afterwards they say, well, that just means every 4 elections, Trump's going to win. It wasn't that much of a long shot. It wasn't that much of a surprise. It was a surprise. It wasn't that much of a surprise. So anyway, the 538 folks are currently saying nationwide 7 in 9 chance for the Democrats to take the House. And then they've got, if you're looking at the picture, it looks like a map that I'm trying to figure out a way to say this without sounding too technical. It's an 8-bit map. It's just, it looks, you can barely recognize the nation in this map. For those of you in the audio audience, it's just a bunch of 6-sided objects, hexagons. Is that it? Hexagons? Big blocky things. You put the cursor over it and it becomes a little clearer, but now we can sort of see the outline of North Carolina. So let me blow this up a little bit. And we see the 13 congressional districts. They show 4 of them as solid red, which means a very strong chance that the Republican is going to win. They show 3 of them as solid green, which is the kind of the way that things have been gerrymandered. 3 districts that the Democrats have a very strong chance of winning, like District 4, where David Price is. They're giving him a greater than 99 and 100% chance, greater than 99 and 100 chance of winning. And the other one is District 1, northeast corner of the state, Outer Banks. G.K. Butterfield is the candidate there, the incumbent, also a 99% chance. So I'm going to look at this District 2. There it is. And in this poll, or this, it's not one poll. They put together lots of polls and then come up with their amalgamation of them. They give Holding a 5 in 6 chance. It's a pretty good chance of winning. And Linda Coleman a 1 in 6. So I don't know if they've taken into account, and probably haven't because it's so new, this this new poll that shows Coleman is about 50-50. But Holding's own poll, it said, let's see what that said. Yeah, this is from August 20th, so it's a while ago. And his own poll was saying about 50-50, down by 3 points. And yet, oh, there it is. And yet this 538 is showing that he's got a 5 in 6 chance. What do they know that we don't know? And then here's the pure toss-up. This is the district that's at the very southern end of the state. Dan McCready and Mark Harris. And McCready's 5 and 9. Mark Harris is 4 and 9. McCready is the Democrat. Harris is the Republican. So that one is a toss-up. That's the one that has the best chance of adding a 4th Democrat to North Carolina, despite the gerrymandering. And then the District 2 with Holding and Coleman, well, we'll see. Anyway, that's all. It's the horse race stuff. Horse race. That's what we're interested in, isn't it? A horse race. When I was on that legendary motorcycle trip in '86, it was an election year, and I was traveling around the country, and I would pick up the local newspaper. That's where I learned that local newspapers, because I grew up in Chicago, I grew up reading the Tribune. Tribune had bureaus and reporters back then everywhere, all around the country, all around the world. I was provincial about it. As far as I was concerned, that's the way newspapers were. They had reporters everywhere. I suppose they ran an AP story or a UPI story once in a while. I suppose. Don't remember. It's been a long time. But then I traveled around the country and got into a lot of small towns and picked up the local newspaper and found that most of those towns were like Raleigh or smaller. They did not have a bureau and a reporter all over the country, and certainly not all over the world. News and Observer is part of McClatchy now, and McClatchy does have bureaus and reporters in Washington and some places around the world. But they still run a lot of national stories out of the Associated Press. And that's what I learned as I was on that trip. It's the AP. The AP is the source for national and international news for most newspapers, unless they're really big. You know, New York Times, Washington Post. I just subscribed to the Washington Post. The digital version. They were running a deal for $50 for a year, and I got tired, I guess, of Google bringing up news headlines from the Washington Post and going to them and say and getting the "you've used up your 4 stories for this month," and it's only the 5th of the month. "You've used up your 4 stories. Subscribe." And then this deal came up, and I figure $50, that's easy. I don't know what I'll do next year when it's probably going to be more like 120. Tough to pony up. I pony up more than that for the News and Observer digital version. Happy to do that. But at least for the next year, I'll be able to look at the Washington Post stories as well. Now where I was... So I need somebody to take notes and to give me a line by line where I was before I talked my way out of the story. Okay, now I remember. The Associated Press and all these stories as I was riding around the country. And remember, this is the year that I had decided not to take a job as a talk show guy at a radio station in Peoria for let's see, 2, maybe 3 reasons. Wanted to take the motorcycle trip. Really wanted to take the motorcycle trip. It was getting stoned almost every day and didn't really feel like my head was clear enough to be able to do something like this. So kids, just say no to drugs. Bad idea. And I hadn't been paying attention. I had not been following the news very carefully. Yeah, I read the News and Observer. I read the Chicago Tribune every day, and I watched the news on TV, but I just washed over. And I didn't read the difficult, more political stories. I read Mike Royko because he was fun. Mike Royko was their world famous columnist. Some of you might know the name. Some of you older people might know the name. I don't know how much of a national reputation he had. He was certainly well known in Chicago. Curmudgeon, bane of the political class reporter in Chicago. But I wasn't up to date. I didn't know the places. I didn't know the people. I didn't much know the issues. So I thought, I'm going to pay attention to the issues. I'm going to read the issues about what's going on in this presidential campaign. Reagan, and who was Reagan running against? First time? What, Carter, I guess. Anyway, there weren't any issue stories in the paper. It was all horse race. And the horse race is what we're interested in. That's the exciting part. Who's ahead in the polls? The issues lie behind it. And I would like to say that the issues should be important. Something inside me says the issues should be important. But in a political campaign, there'll be a couple of hot button things that candidates will issues that they will claim as their own, issues that they will beat the other candidate over the head with, but they're just the big hot button stories. They're the couple of things that they are hoping that will grab you, that their ads can sway you with. If they're elected, they may actually do something about them at some point. They may not. They will run, no matter what the race is, president down to Congress. They will run as if they alone can take this issue by the horns and make it happen. That's exactly what Trump said. I've been working on my Trump impression, and now I'm afraid to try it. I need to go back to the rehearsal room. Only I can solve the war in the Middle East and fix the economy. Half a dozen things, I think he said. He's the only one that can do it. Only him. So they didn't write about the issues very much. Just the horse race. And you'll hear, again, in this election, you will hear people talking about issues, but you won't hear about depth. And obviously there's a good reason for that. You'd be bored to death if they talked about policy in depth, how they were going to get to implement things, what the details of any given policy would be, assuming that they won and got whatever it was into law. You'd fall asleep if they got into that. A vote based on general direction. Figure out which candidate is going to push the city, county, state, school board, nation in the general direction that I want, and vote for them. A couple shows ago, I was talking about Silent Sam and the Civil War monuments. And my general position is, takes the side that these are monuments to people that, if you are from the South and you have Confederate ancestry and you lean in the direction that these are historical and it's your heritage, I understand those feelings. I lean in the direction that all that very well may be true, all that is true, but what all of those people were fighting for was the ability to enslave another race of people. And that, pardon the expression, trumps everything else. And so the compromise that I would look for, because it is people's heritage, it is people's ancestors, it is people that, can I say they're proud of them? Well, if you're proud of them, that may say a little bit more about you than you think it does. Very briefly, my German ancestry that I've talked about before. Well, for one thing, it wasn't taught. My parents, my mom, this is on my mom's side, did not teach us about their history. I was growing up in a couple of decades after World War II, so it probably wasn't a real popular thing to talk about. I learned nothing about it. I learned more about it in school and since then, and hold no pride in the German ancestry that took place leading up to World War II. Plenty of pride in what Germany has become since then. But I don't have I would say plenty of pride. I actually don't think about it. Again, not having been taught, not having been steeped in any kind of German history, it's a fact. I'm aware of it. I know the name. I know the names of relatives going on my mom's side going back to grandparents. No farther back than that. And only met them a couple times. In fact, my grandfather, who was sort of a Nazi apologist, I don't know that I've ever met him. I think I might have met him once when I was a real young kid. We would go to visit my grandmother now and then. He had long ago left, and then before he died, he was out traveling the world or hiding in South America, perhaps. I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Shh. Family dirty little secret, I guess. I mean, no one even said that. I'm going to have to ask my brother, Jay. My brother is 5 years younger than me, Jay, and he remembers everything. Many things I've forgotten a long time ago. So I lean on that side of the monuments equation, that a compromise, because we don't want to forget the history, we don't want to tear them down and destroy them, is move them someplace more appropriate. I don't even think I would go as far, although in the essence of, or in the spirit of compromise, I might be persuaded that just adding to the monument in place, like this commission is suggesting we do with the monuments that are on the Capitol grounds, that we add something to them. It's going to get a little crowded, but put some additional context around them. So that's sort of a maybe. My preference would be to move them to a museum, battlefield, cemetery, and add context, but not have them up there in our most of public places, celebrating the idea that these people fought a war to keep other people in slavery. That's the bottom line for me. So I was talking about that. I think I remember where this rabbit hole began. Talking about that in previous episodes. And I admitted that my historical background was a little weak I remembered, and this is from a college class, so it would have been about 1971, 1972, a class on U.S. history, and going to take an exam and coming up to the question, well, what happened after the Civil War? What was the major thrust of American history between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century? And I hadn't studied very well. I was a pretty good college student, a terrible high school student, pretty good college student. But I was having trouble pulling that one out. And then I remembered westward expansion. Civil War, we certainly did not occupy the entire continent. I think we may have when we added states and territories, we had most of the continent. Our current, not the whole North American continent, obviously. There's still Mexico and Canada. My geography's not that bad. Most of the territory that makes up the current 48 contiguous states. They weren't all states. There's a lot of territory and maybe some Indian land or something that we hadn't claimed yet. So a lot of what was going on between the Civil War and the turn of the century was adding more states to the West. What I didn't put into that answer in the test, what I missed big time, was, of course, Reconstruction. And my friend Jim in the On the Road episode said, of course, Reconstruction. And then I had another big blank in my memory. And for those of you history buffs, you just think I'm an idiot. For those of you that are not history buffs, you'll hang on my every word and say, okay, Gary, fill us in. What did you miss? What are we missing? Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the period after the war when the North won and the South had been devastated and needed to get rebuilt. But the South was also run by racist Confederate governments that were essentially replaced by the carpetbaggers, by the folks came down from the North and said, we're going to run the show here for a while, and they were backed up by federal troops. A lot of laws were passed to give former slaves equality, voting rights. They were elected to office. All of this was highly forced, and it was backed up by federal troops that said this is the way it's going to be. Folks in the South were not happy about that. I'll let you assign your own level of racism to that, at least for the moment. They were unhappy about it, and they didn't want to put up with it. And so Lincoln was assassinated. Grant, the general that won the Civil War, was president for a term, maybe two. I'm not that good a history buff. Next election, Rutherford B. Hayes was winning a squeaker. It was really close. And the election wasn't decided yet. The election wasn't fully decided. It was going to be pretty contentious. And so the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's another rabbit hole to get into, who was who in Republicans and Democrats at that point, came up with a compromise so that the South would not, I guess, rebel again at a toss-up federal election. And The compromise was that they would go along with Hayes being elected if the North would pull the federal troops out of the South and basically take hands off Southern governments. And apparently the North, politicians in the North were kind of tired of running the South, so they said, okay, you got your South back. This history fills books. It does not fill my head. I looked it up on like Wikipedia. Here it is on Wikipedia. The Compromise of 1877, an informal, unwritten deal that settled the intensely disputed 1876 presidential election, resulted in the federal government pulling the last troops out of the South, and that formally ended the Reconstruction era. And Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the White House over Democrat Samuel J. Tilden on the understanding that Hayes would remove the federal troops whose support was essential for the survival of the Republican state governments in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And that's about as detailed as I was going to get about it. I don't know what the details were for like North Carolina and the other southern states. I don't know where they stood in terms of federally mandated control over the state governments. But the South got control of the governments again. The party was Democrats. And if you are not steeped in fairly recent history, that's not the Democrats that we've got today. And that change pretty much happened in my lifetime. Democrats were the party of, in the South anyway, the South particularly, the party of racism and Jim Crow. And the Republicans, well, they weren't in the South very much at all. It was Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act in 64, 68, 64, 60, anyway, somewhere in there. That was the beginning of turning the South from Democrat to Republican. And I didn't really want to go there. Where I wanted to go was that after this compromise, Democrats took over the governments again, began Jim Crow, started voting rights laws that stripped voting from the freed black population, ran them out of office, started segregation, started all of the laws and what else would you call them? I mean, there were laws, but just the way things were, that black people were severely oppressed and suppressed. And being, a guy from up north, a Yankee, like apparently, it's important to say that it was, well, not only in the South, it happened all over the country. It happened in the South legally and officially. It happened in places that I lived and during my lifetime by just the way people did things. There were no laws that kept black people from voting, that told them they had to live in specific areas, that they couldn't use, you couldn't go to restaurants and hotels and things like that. And things were more democratic, less, there was less overt segregation in the North, but it certainly still existed. again, my lily white suburb that I grew up in with almost no black people. It's a good example. That was in the 60s. When down here in North Carolina, the students were sitting in at the lunch counter in Greensboro that was officially segregated and they weren't supposed to go to. So, sort of the difference. So why the Jim Crow laws? Well, I'm open to listening to folks with Confederate heritage tell me why those were a good idea. The only thing I can think of is that those white people hated black people with a passion. Racism. And so all those laws. Plenty of articles that said they were genetically inferior, etc., etc. But that era was virulent racism. You had Ku Klux Klan, lynchings. That was the time and the territory. So now, when you look at the heritage that you are looking back on and saying, my ancestors fought in the Civil War, and I want to commemorate them. We want to memorialize them. We want our monuments up. It's not just the Civil War. It's the Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction era, the Jim Crow era, that those monuments are celebrating, commemorating. If you are a black person and your ancestors were slaves, that's what you see. Easily that's what you see when you look at them. And now I will confess, I guess, that I have been down to the Capitol, downtown Raleigh, many times, and I saw statues. I don't think I read the plaques and the inscriptions. Maybe I'd read them enough to realize that they are Civil War monuments. It would seem logical. And just looking at them, I did not absorb the offense that other people might feel. Didn't think about them much. It's like, oh, yeah, North Carolina, Civil War, makes sense. Doesn't make sense anymore. I get it. I guess I'm a little bit woke. The late night comics are back. Oh, next, I'm changing the subject. Yay, the late night comics are back. Everybody's been on vacation for a couple of weeks. You know, it's interesting that almost universally the late night comics are anti-Trump. Really seriously anti-Trump. Colbert, Seth Meyers, my brain, it's getting late. With Jimmy Fallon being the only one that has not been pretty darn political in his monologues. I don't know if he's getting a little more or not, but I saw a story that he was kind of getting beat up in the ratings. Colbert was taking over. Trevor Noah, name I was forgetting. I'm trying to think if Conan O'Brien, I guess I don't watch him very much. I've got that YouTube TV thing now that I can actually see TBS on, and he's on there, and I watch now and then. I can't remember how political he gets. Not as much as Colbert. Colbert really lit in. And, of course, Trevor Noah and Seth Meyers. All anti-Trump, with Jimmy Fallon being maybe kind of, certainly not pro-Trump, but just staying a little bit more neutral. I don't really have much to say about that other than it's kind of interesting where they're getting their audience. I mean, if you're conservative, does that It doesn't leave you with anybody funny. It leaves you with Fox News. If you want to push it farther, maybe Alex Jones. You don't have anybody funny. That's a thing too, that there aren't really much in the way of conservative comedians. I've looked on YouTube specifically for conservative comedians. No names come to mind, but somebody showed up and I went and looked, and what was allegedly funny was basically just trashing liberals. And I guess, sort of like Turnabout looking at Colbert, just trashing Trump. So, maybe that was funny, I guess. I mean, I think Colbert is funny and the conservatives not going to. So maybe conservative watching a comedian just spend his act trashing liberals and Democrats is it's going to be funny, I guess. The divided states of America. But most of the prominent late night comedians have decided which way to cast their lot. Don't take that as an omen of things to come, blue wave or not, because they were that way before the election. And didn't help. Let's see, what else? I'm looking over my tabs here, and no, my tabs aren't telling me anything else. Watching a new show on Prime that I was turned on to, listening to the Make Me Smart podcast. Kai Risdall and Molly Wood were talking about a new series on Amazon Prime called Jack Ryan. And I have watched episode 1. The first season is out. I don't know if they did it all at once like Netflix does. I don't think they did, but all of the first season is out, and I hadn't watched any of it yet. So I watched the pilot, episode 1. Thought it was pretty good. Jack Ryan is the Tom Clancy character, CIA analyst who keeps on going out into the field and being a hero, but not a superhero, just sort of a reluctant hero, and then more and more of a hero. And that's kind of the way they're playing the TV version. So I will go watch some more of that when I get done with this. And I watched, I tried The Man in the High Castle, and I think I'm going to give up on that. I got in maybe 10, 12 episodes, far enough that, I gave it a fair shot. And it was kind of interesting. Great premise. There was a thread on Reddit that talked about the show, and the comments that I pretty much agreed with were the great concept, not very well executed. The writing's not very good. The acting is not very good. The production values, the sets, the locations, all that stuff was top-notch. Folks in Hollywood know how to do that really well. Give them enough money, and they can make things look great. But if you don't have the writing and you don't have the acting, the show is not going to be that great. I think it gets pretty good ratings, but I think I'm giving up on it. There's another show similar, the Americans, which has got one more season left to go. I think it's on FX or something, but I'm watching it on Prime because they're in 5 or 6 seasons, and I'm just starting to watch that. Once again, somebody said, you should watch that show. It's pretty good. And it's a notch better. The Americans is a show about set in the 80s, I think. The concept is that Russia has embedded spies living as ordinary Americans. They keep saying this in the in the opening credits. They look like us. They talk like us. They have better English than we do. You wouldn't be able to tell, but they are Russian spies. And it follows primarily a man and a woman who are a couple. They have some kids, but it's a phony baloney marriage because they were both recruited spies, and they're living in America. And I'm into that one, 6 episodes maybe, and they're having trouble staying true to their true to their mother country, to their ideology. Because you got to wonder, I don't know if there are really any people like that, but you live here long enough, if you're, in the middle class or above, and these people are, there's certainly plenty of people that live here that will look at America and say, yeah, what's so great? Maybe you do need to make it great again, because for some people it's not working. And I'm not talking about Trump voters, although maybe some of them. But these folks, and they've mentioned it, that electricity works, the food's pretty good. The things that they had been taught, the propaganda that they had heard as they were growing up, they are seeing, it's not the way things really are. So that's the premise of the show. I'm not sure how far they can hold it. I guess they'll do one more season. I think it's season 6 that's about to come out. So I keep thinking, is that the show I want to watch when I'm watch them when I'm working out or sometimes in the evening? Is that Cindy doesn't like them? Is that the show I want to watch? Is there something better? Do I want to go back to trying to catch up with Hawaii 5-0 here at Peak Television? It's all going to fall apart as soon as the next series of Marvel shows on Netflix comes out. And one of my favorites, the Avengers TV version, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., also hasn't done quite well enough, so it's bumped to a summer replacement for next year. So got a long wait for the next season of that to come out. Those would bump off things like The Americans pretty quickly, and get back to that when there's nothing else. Can also resurrect any of the Star Trek series. Start over on them. Not quite ready to watch West Wing over again. I've seen that, been through that maybe 3 times, so it takes that long before I can actually sort of remember what each episode is about. I need to give a little more time for my brain to forget that. So I'll watch one more of what was it? Oh, Jack Ryan. So far, that episode 1 was pretty good. Oh, and I think I'm giving up mostly on the CW version of the DC superhero shows. I'm trying to get the Green Arrow, not Green Lantern, Green Arrow and Flash. Supergirl is way too much angst. Way too much teenage angst. And the other two, not quite as bad, but it's a lot of feelings. I don't want my superheroes to have feelings. One last thing. I watched as much as I could of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings yesterday, the opening day. He didn't get to talk very much. He gave a talk, his introductory speech at the very end. And speechifying is what everybody else did. All the senators get to talk for 10 minutes or so. It was all pretty predictable. Democrats were complaining that they didn't get all the documents they wanted, and they got a dump of 47,000 pages the night before. Well, the Republicans go, yeah, of course we did. So they wanted to delay things. The Republicans are saying he's highly qualified, maybe one of the best qualified candidates there's been for the Supreme Court for a long time. And we know that he will render decisions based on the law. Every judge says that. It's bullshit. We have way too many 5-4 decisions on the Supreme Court that people are rendering decisions based on the law. They are rendering decisions on both sides. Rendering decisions based on their ideology, on politics. We know Kavanaugh's politics. And most of the Democrats and Republicans, and probably all of them on the Judiciary Committee that's doing the hearings, know which way they're going to vote. They knew which way they were going to vote when they walked into the room. The Republicans accused the Democrats of knowing which way they were going to vote, which is, of course, hypocritical because they also knew which way they were going to vote. But in the General Senate, there are a few Democrats and maybe a Republican or two that are not sure, and they're just putting a finger in the political winds to see which way they will blow for their re-election, depending on which way they vote on Kavanaugh. Today I didn't get to watch very much of it. I watched a little bit. It's it's running full time on the cable networks. And here it was the Q&A, but it was all, again, pretty predictable. One senator, and I don't remember which one it was, said what I generally think, and he said it pretty well. And that is basically the same idea, that the judges will render decisions based on their ideology, their politics, and not... How do you render something based on the law? Because you're interpreting the law. And if the law was clear enough that it didn't tell you what it was going to be, what you need, how you needed to interpret it. If it was clear enough that it needed no interpretation, you wouldn't need a judge. Everyone would understand. We disagree on how it's to be interpreted. And it is so obvious that the judges are put in place at that level by their political leanings and biases that it's just kabuki theater that we're pretending at any point in these hearings that it's not. One of the more significant points is that a judge like Kavanaugh, who's been a lower court judge for a long time, pretty much has to pay attention to Supreme Court precedent and higher courts precedents. So if he's looking to rule on a case and something about that case has already been ruled on before, he needs to look at what those prior rulings were, the precedents, and weigh that heavily in reaching a decision. He can reach a different decision. Nothing stops him from that. Nothing requires him to follow precedent. But if he doesn't, then his chances of having the case appealed and overturned on appeal, either to a higher court or the Supreme Court, get pretty strong. When you're on the Supreme Court, there's nothing that tells you that you have to follow precedent. Even, well, the Supreme Court's prior cases, they call that stare decisis. Doing something because that's the way it was decided before. Supreme Court justices talk about following precedent a lot. But I looked this up. I didn't bring it in for the show. I wasn't intending to go into any depth about it, maybe a previous show. But there have been lots and lots of times when the Supreme Court has overturned previous Supreme Court rulings. Dred Scott. The Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to separate races in schools, that all of the Southern segregation was legal. They said that was legal for a long time, and then they overturned those. But there's been lots of others. I looked it up in Wikipedia, and the list was pretty long. What I didn't do was go into any depth on most of those cases to see what the details were, because I didn't have a week to spend doing that kind of research. Mostly I wanted a number, and there were dozens and dozens of cases where the Supreme Court overturned previous Supreme Court rulings. Some of them, like Roe v. Wade, Brown versus Board of Education, are so politically fraught to overturn them that that's probably not going to happen. Well, Brown is probably not going to happen. Roe v. Wade, well, the Democrats certainly want you to quake with the idea that Kavanaugh would be the vote that would overturn it. Most likely, he would allow it to be chipped away and not wholesale overturned. But there's no guarantee. So be afraid. Be very afraid. And the last point I'll make is that gets me to the point where, once again, I recognize that making an appointment to the Supreme Court may be the most consequential thing a president can do. And in the right circumstances, a president can do that several times in his term or two terms, or her term or two terms. Someday we'll have a her. I hope within my lifetime. I hope pretty soon. A president can appoint multiple Supreme Court justices, and while the president's term is limited to 8 years, if they win re-election, the Supreme Court justice that they appoint can go dozens of years and have a significant and maybe more significant effect on the laws that affect each of us in our daily lives. Some of us more than others. I don't know that I feel all that impacted by very many of them, but some people do much more. And so if a Supreme Court nomination may be the most important thing a president can do, a vote for president, then by the process of transmorgification, becomes a vote on who might end up on the Supreme Court. And that makes the potential makeup of the Supreme Court the most important thing about your vote for a president. But when you're voting for president, you probably don't think about that much. I do anymore. I am Gary Pierce, your loyal snowflake. Sometimes I don't feel too snowflakey, but I guess right now I am. And this is the Triangle Chalk Show, episode 27, Politics. It's September 5th as I record this, getting late, 10:30. Gerry Mandate. That could have been my old radio name, Gerry Mandate. That would have been hilarious. All right, you guys. Time to go. Over and out.